Welcome to Musings from Arledge. Over the last few weeks, I've been interviewing some great Trojans, including legends like Mark Carrier and Sammy Knight, All Pac-10 offensive lineman Brad Leggett, and my very good friend Rod McNeil. I'm going to take a break from Trojan heroes this week to talk about villains. Not Trojan villains. I know what you're all thinking. This is time for another Arledge diatribe against Clay Helton, Pat Hayden, Lynn Swan. It's not, I promise. Those guys aren't villains. They were terrible at their jobs. Terrible. And USC has a horrible history of hiring people because they're insiders and they have some connection to USC. Who hires Paul Hackett to be your head coach? This is a nondescript coordinator who had one head coaching job at the University of Pittsburgh and was terrible. There's no way that gets hired except for the fact that he used to be an offensive coordinator under John Robinson at USC. That's the only reason that guy even gets an interview. USC does that all the time. It's ridiculous. It's how we got saddled with what we've been saddled with for much of the last 10 years. No, strike that, much of the last 40. It's only when they hire outsiders like Pete Carroll or Lincoln Riley that we have a chance. But that's not what I'm talking about. Those guys aren't villains. They were bad at their jobs, but they were fighting for the good guys. They just didn't fight very well. No, all of our villains are outsiders. Today, I'm going to talk about the 5 biggest villains in USC football history. I'm going to start with number 5. Number 5 on our list of villains, Phil Knight. I understand this one's a little bit complicated because Phil Knight and his company Nike have had a long relationship with USC. And USC's been signing deals with Nike for many years, which means Nike's paid USC a lot of money. USC believes they've gotten something valuable out of the deal with Nike. I know AD and Nike had a history where AD helped put them on the map. So I know this is complicated, but here's the thing. Phil Knight, in addition to his business interests, has a very personal interest in promoting Oregon football. When I say promoting Oregon football, he's trying to turn Oregon into a football power. In fact, he wants Oregon to be the premier football power on the West Coast. Now, they're not. They never have been. They never will be. In fact, they're almost to the end of their little run. They're hurtling towards the cliff. The brakes are out. There's no way to stop them, I don't think. With USC and UCLA gone, LA is gone. It means the Pac-12, which was already becoming an irrelevant conference, suddenly has no relevancy whatsoever. And Oregon's going to be just as popular and just as influential as its future conference rival, San Diego State. That's what's coming. But over the last 20 years, let's be honest, Phil Knight has done a pretty good job of building a brand for Oregon to the point where Oregon is a legitimate recruiting rival for USC, which is staggering and awful. How has he done it? He's done it by convincing high school players that the most important thing is to wear a different uniform every week. Almost every single one of those uniforms absurdly ugly, and that the key is to have really fancy facilities with a bunch of video game consoles. That's what he's selling. Not selling tradition. He's not selling an education. He's selling crappy uniforms and lots of them. That's not great. Now, I'm not saying Phil Knight has ruined an entire generation of high school kids. I'm just saying he's tried. And Phil Knight comes in, from my perspective, as the guy who is pushing Oregon football, which I hate, as the number 5 villain on this list. Number 4, Larry Scott, former Pac-12 commissioner. In 2009, after a number of years of overseeing a sport that nobody cares about and nobody watches, Larry Scott moved to the Pac-12 to become commissioner so he could turn the Pac-12 into a conference that nobody cares about and nobody watches. And he succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Keep in mind that when Larry Scott had come over, USC for pretty much the 8 years before he had gotten there was the elite program in college football. And the Pac-12 was relevant. The Pac-12 games were a big deal. Since Larry Scott got to the Pac-12, all that collapsed. Now, part of that, of course, was that shortly after Larry Scott arrived, the NCAA's kangaroo court came down and tried to destroy USC football. Larry Scott, of course, did nothing at all to help, despite the fact that it was an outrageous decision and the penalties were outrageous. We'll talk about more of that later. So he does nothing to help his flagship program, which is being taken down. And not surprisingly, the Pac-12 starts to tank immediately thereafter. But here's the thing. The centerpiece of Larry Scott's almost said Larry Scott's tragedy, which would have been right. His strategy was the Pac-12 network, which is maybe the single worst media rights idea that any conference or sports franchise has ever had. It's been nothing but a monumental disaster. Now we know that. We know that the conference has slipped behind others in terms of their revenues, largely because the Pac-12 network is a network that nobody can watch and most people don't want to watch. But here's the thing that you often don't think about. USC and its Pac-12 colleagues were in a position to actually become the first super conference, because shortly after Larry Scott came on board, Oklahoma and Texas were just about ready to sign up with the Pac-12. Now here's the thing. If you get USC, Texas, and Oklahoma in a conference, and then you have second-rate but solid powers, Washington, UCLA, and Oregon also in that conference, you're now talking about a conference that can compete with the Big Ten and maybe even the SEC in terms of viability, especially in light of USC's very recent past at that point, because USC had been the dominant program. All of this blows up because Texas wants the Longhorn Network, and they want to make their money from it. Now, a lot of people blame Texas for being greedy on this. I don't. Texas says we can get the Longhorn Network and make a lot of money, or we can, at the Pac-12's insistence, give up the Longhorn Network and sign off on Larry Scott's debacle. I don't blame Texas for saying no to that. Everybody in the conference should have said no to that. If you want to know why the Pac-12 is almost dead today, and as of next year, when USC and UCLA leave, will absolutely be dead, the chief suspect is Larry Scott. Larry Scott murdered the Pac-12. That's why he's USC football villain number 4. Coming in at number 3, Cade McNown, UCLA quarterback. From 1991 to 1998, UCLA beat USC 8 straight times. A horrible thing to think about and horrible to live through. The idea of losing to the crosstown little brother that many times in a row is shocking and awful and embarrassing. I still don't like talking about it. But because we're talking about villains, I kind of have to. The last 4 of those UCLA wins in that streak was with Cade McNown at quarterback. And some of those games were absolutely brutal. In 1995, 11th ranked USC goes in against a 500 UCLA team. USC's ranked number 11. They've already wrapped up the conference title. They're headed to the Rose Bowl. Wasn't an amazing football team, but it was a good one, and it was a good season. UCLA is garbage, as usual, quarterbacked by a true freshman. And at the Coliseum, no less, UCLA wins. A horrible loss that really stained what was otherwise a really nice season. Very, very ugly. The next year, 1996, was even worse. Cade McNown and UCLA overcome a 17-point fourth quarter deficit to beat USC in one of the worst games I've ever attended in person. It was completely disgusting. UCLA with Cade McNown at quarterback go on to win the next 2 as well. There is a silver lining, however, in this, and that is in that 4th straight win by Cade McNown, the only quarterback ever to win 4 straight in this series. McNown, at the very end of a 17-point win, decides to run a little bootleg just to rub it in. There was no other reason to run that play, none at all. The cocky little twerp decided he wanted to do something to rub it in. He was having fun, and so he did. And immediately, the football gods became angry, and the curse of Cade dropped on the Bruins, very heavy. They choked the next week against Miami and lost the chance to play in the national title game. They fell apart in the Rose Bowl against Wisconsin and lost that one. They started a streak of being terrible that has lasted almost to the present day. And Cade McNown himself went to the NFL, where he had a 3-12 winning record with the Chicago Bears, and where he threw more interceptions than touchdowns. All of which goes to show that the football gods can be just, and that thankfully bad things do sometimes happen to bad people. But Cade McNown, villain number 3. Villain number 2, Lou Holtz. A true-life leprechaun, Lou Holtz was listed at 5'10" and 152 pounds. There is no way in the world Lou Holtz was even that big. He was a tiny, strange-looking little man with an odd lisp, very thick glasses, and the look, truly, of a leprechaun. I can't imagine a better place for him to coach than at Notre Dame. Here's the thing, though. That guy's teams, they played big. The legendary Irish coach went 9-0-1 in his first 10 games against USC, and some of those games will leave scars that will never heal for me and for many Trojan fans. In my very first in-person USC Notre Dame game in 1986, the Irish overcame a 17-point fourth quarter deficit, both because USC fell apart and because of a terrible pro-Notre Dame call by the officials, which you have to get used to if you're going to be a USC fan, and because of a special teams breakdown at the very end. It was a disastrous game. Disastrous. It wasn't going to get any better. 2 years later at the Coliseum, 1988, this is the famous number 1 versus number 2 game, and USC hands the game to the Irish by turning the ball over and over again. It was horrific. It was the most disappointing loss, I think, in my entire time as a fan of USC. Still hard to deal with. 1989, the next year, USC has a 10-point lead at halftime in South Bend after a giant brawl breaks out before the game. It's finally time to get revenge on those guys, and USC wears down as the game goes on, and Tony Rice and the Irish start to beat up on a great USC defense, and they take over the game and win. Those 3 games, when I was still at a very impressionable age, between the ages of 13 and 16, left scars that will never heal. It gave me the Notre Dame PTSD that I still deal with today. Lou Holtz is a villain. Great coach, completely weird character, and in fact, a great coach. But even here there's a silver lining. Because after not being able to beat Holtz for a full decade, in 1996, number 10 Notre Dame comes into the Coliseum against a pretty lousy USC team, the one that had just blown that 17-point lead in the fourth quarter to Cade McNown and UCLA. And the stars align. And somehow, some way, USC gets the win. It takes a missed extra point to keep Notre Dame with only an 8-point lead in the fourth quarter. The Trojans score a touchdown. DeLon Washington gets a 2-point conversion to send it into overtime. Mark Cusano bats down Ron Paulus's pass in overtime to win it for USC. This was a day of great rejoicing. And anybody who was a USC fan who suffered through that horrible streak, and I became a USC fan right when the streak started, which means that I start watching USC football when I'm a kid. I don't see USC beat Notre Dame until I'm in law school. That's how long it was. That win over the Irish in 1996 was glorious. And a devastating loss for Lou Holtz. I've seen the quotes from him about how much that loss hurt. You know what, Lou? I'm glad. I hope it hurts. I hope it hurts forever, because you've hurt me. Lou Holtz is a villain number 2 on our list. Coming in at number 1, the greatest villain in USC football history, Paul D. Paul D was the chairman of the NCAA Infractions Committee, the kangaroo court that destroyed USC by ignoring evidence, making up evidence, and then levying the most extreme penalties since SMU. An outrageous proceeding, which resulted, of course, in all kinds of litigation with Todd McNair, who was blamed as the person who knew about this on the coaching staff and did nothing. McNair was settled with the NCAA because the NCAA completely made up a load of nonsense. It was a horrible outcome. Here's the thing. That alone would make Paul D worthy of being a top five villain in USC football history. But that's not all. Because the thing was, Paul D was also the athletic director at Miami. And while he's sitting on a committee that's destroying USC football because they had one player get money from one idiot down in San Diego, Miami has 73 players who are getting improper benefits from a criminal who got almost $1 billion from a Ponzi scheme that he had set up. I want you to think about this, because the NCAA is a corrupt organization. It's a ridiculous organization. It's in its final throes. It's just about dead, and it couldn't happen to a better group of people. But the poster child for the corruption and arrogance and irrationality of the NCAA is Paul D. Because this is the guy who says, high-profile players demand high-profile compliance. That's what he said USC wasn't doing. Meanwhile, he has 73 players that are hanging out on yachts, getting cash, getting cocaine, getting hookers offered to them, right? It's a life of debauchery that would have made Caligula ashamed. That's what you have dozens and dozens and dozens of Miami players doing over the course of 8 years, right below Paul D's very nose. And when he's confronted with this, his response is, we didn't have any suspicion that he was doing anything like this. That's his response to this Miami booster who's loading up all of Miami's players with money and hookers and coke. An outrageous story. Paul D was a horrible, horrible villain. He deserves all the hatred that USC has poured over him for all these years. Now, I'm not saying that Paul D is Satan. I'm not. I am saying that Paul D probably got a 1099 from Satan Enterprises just about everywhere, because he was doing Satan's work. And when I look at the top 5 villains in USC football history, nobody deserves the #1 spot more than Paul D. Let me know if you disagree. If there are other villains that I've overlooked, let me know. But that's my top 5 biggest villains in USC football history. Thanks for watching Musings from Arledge.